Hello, everyone. I'm Newsy Nick. Thank you for coming out today. Today we have a wonderful discussion that's going to be led by Colin Williams. He's the editor of the Pittsburgh City Paper, who's also a member of our Pittsburgh Media Partnership. We have a lovely panel today. Colin will get started, introduce to you what the topic is going to be, and then introduce our panelists. Thank you all for being here. I'm Newsy Nick. I'll see you tomorrow and every Thursday here in Market Square, and let's get it started. Thank you.
Yeah! Woo!
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. Really appreciate it and excited to be here with you all today. So our discussion today is focusing on a problem that has wide-reaching implications specifically for downtown, which is the main area where services are provided to people who lack a permanent shelter. So we are talking really about the homelessness crisis. We're talking about the way that manifests in our city and also what we can do as we're looking for sort of multi-pronged approaches to solutions here in Pittsburgh. So I've got a couple panelists with me here today. First of all, we have, let me get my sheet out here. We have Dave Lettrich. He is the founder of Bridge to the Mountains. Bridge to the Mountains assists members of the street community by working to ensure basic needs and connecting them to services here in Pittsburgh. We also have Dr. Heather Starr-Fiedler. Heather she chairs the Department of Community Engagement and Leadership at Point Park University and is the director of the PhD program in community engagement. And her work focuses on university community partnerships and helps serving the community's basic needs through those. And lastly, but not least, we have Dr. Bob McInerney. Dr. Bob founded the Mobile Thriving Respite in 2017, which seeks to work with members of the street community to thrive instead of to merely survive here in Pittsburgh. So I want to start off by focusing on what is the what here in Pittsburgh. Really, my question is kind of both statistical and a little bit more emotional as well. What are the current main challenges with supporting people who are outside here in Pittsburgh? And what are we talking about just in terms of numbers and impact? And maybe I can start with you, Dave.
So the current challenges that exist here in our city when it comes to individuals experiencing homelessness is it's no different than it's been as long as I've been out here over the past 10 years. There are different aspects of it that ebb and flow and change over time. Currently, we're in a space where we've seen a substantial increase post-COVID of the number of individuals experiencing homelessness. Prior to COVID and during COVID, we saw fundamental changes also. During COVID, we actually had lower numbers than we've ever seen before. And then so we sort of had a backlash, if you will, for those individuals that might have experienced homelessness during COVID, that while there were additional supports in place to help prevent that, we're able to avoid it. But then once those supports went away, we ended up sort of with everybody that would have experienced homelessness during COVID and everybody that was in place post-COVID. So we had sort of a surge over the past couple of years. And that surge placed a tax on the resources that we have always had in place. For many years, we had a pretty solid pace of turnover and programs and services and housing and shelter that fit very well with the population numbers that we were serving. And we just haven't quite been able to figure out the best way to make the right adjustments post-COVID, because our numbers are increasing at the same time that our property values are going up, that access to affordable housing is decreasing. And all of the services throughout the course from where we are at Outreach all the way up through shelter and housing and other supportive services, we're lacking capacity with where we were before based on where we are now with numbers. So I think that's sort of a general picture, I think, of where things are right now and kind of how we got here.
So there's sort of a perception crisis here in Pittsburgh, right? That often plays out in these kind of Twitter battles and things like that, where locals seem to see people experiencing homelessness as a safety threat, or in some cases, as I've seen the allegation of choosing a vagrant lifestyle, which I think is rather unfair to say. So I'm curious, even when it comes to terms like unhoused, and maybe I can turn this question to you, Dr. Heather. What is the public missing about the causes and the consequences of homelessness in these discussions?
Well, I think that a big piece of this is really understanding that these are people, and it's not necessarily a choice. Sometimes it may be, but usually it is not a choice. And you need to think about them in terms of who they are as individuals. And that's something that I'm going to toss it to Dr. Bob in a minute, because he's really great about really meeting people where they are and helping them to thrive. But I think one of the things that we need to really consider is that social media is not a great place to have this conversation. It's really easy to sit behind your keyboard in your home or your office and have opinions about people that you've never met and what their circumstances may be that have led them to where they are. So I think the more that we can get out and actually meet people and learn their stories and learn who they are as human beings, the more we can help dispel those myths about why people are unhoused and who they are really at their core. And I would love to ask Dr. Bob to weigh in on the work that he does with the mobile respite unit and really thinking about them in terms of how we can help them thrive and not just look at them as numbers.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, I agree with everything Heather has said. Let me just sort of say a little bit more and maybe even say it a little bit differently. Sometimes mental health issues that you think, anyway, you're walking down the street and you think you are recognizing are not innate and inborn things that this person was born with these mental health issues. It's not about some kind of internal unworthiness or internal inabilities or internal pathology. Some of the mental health issues that you're seeing have to do with being in the situations that some folks are in. And so any one of us can find ourselves in that situation, and under a certain amount of stress, we start to behave differently. Do a little experiment, stay at home and don't talk to anyone and don't go on social media and maybe even don't leave the room for a while. You will start to get a little weird, won't you, right? You start talking to yourself, you start acting a little bit differently. Keep in mind also that many folks who, especially if they're in harsh conditions, are in a survival mode. And the survival mode means that there are things that folks will do that you would do too. A lot of this has to do with humility. It's a big thing that I talk about with my students. To have humility means to recognize, as Heather said, the complexity of the human condition, and to recognize that there but for the grace of God, or there but for the grace of whatever your belief systems are, could be you in that way. And so it brings a sense of humility to us, and it makes it easier for us to do what Heather is saying, which is to see the person uniquely and to understand their circumstances as with a kind of empathy. Well, let me just make very clear here. I don't mean empathy in the sense that you put yourself in the other person's shoes. You've heard that expression, right? If you put yourself in the other person's shoes, then you're sort of saying, oh, this is what I would do and this is what I wouldn't do, and these are the choices I'd make, and I'd pull myself up from my bootstraps and all that kind of stuff. The kind of empathy we're talking about requires much more imagination, and it's much more difficult to have. And it is connected to a sense of humility, and it's to decenter yourself. In other words, what would it be like to have that body? What would it be like to be raised in that situation? What would it be like to be in those particular circumstances? And so when we sort of recognize that kind of complexity, it allows us to have this sort of empathy. That empathy allows us to recognize that sort of complexity. And I think that it leads us to be more gentle and more welcoming and more kind. And one last quick thing, and Dave could talk about this more, is that we tend to look at the individual all the time, and we don't look at our systems, governmental systems, and we love them, but critique them, right? In other words, healthcare systems, what's happening there? Are they in some way producing folks that are homeless, so to speak. Other governmental systems in terms of housing, is that part of what's producing it? So a good look at our systems, our governmental systems, local and beyond, is also a good idea to have a better understanding of the phenomenon of homelessness. And I'll give it to the rest of you, but I would like to talk about the language of a homeless. There's folks that we talk to who certainly have homes, and those homes may be in a camp, at a camp, right? So homelessness is a psychological and social phenomenon, not necessarily about what a person perceives as a home. And there's, folks could be nomadic and all kinds of other things that I think Dave especially can talk to.
Yeah, thank you. I do want to say two things. One, you're going to hear a lot of similar philosophies to Bob. There's good reason for that. Bob and his program and his students have been an integral part of our organization since we were founded. And a lot of the things that I've learned through my experiences out here have actually come through those educated, more specifically in the field of psychology by Bob. So you're going to find some similarities there. I do want to point that out and thank Bob for the wonderful job between the Proctor Institutes and everything else that he's done in providing people who are just really well educated and trained and the right perspectives to be out here in the streets. You mentioned in the introductory question some of the misconceptions that exist out there. One of them being danger and violence, right? That is, someone experiencing homelessness is a threat to someone who is not. And it is very clear and it is undisputed, statistically speaking, someone who is experiencing homelessness is far, far, far more likely to become a victim of a violent crime from someone outside the homeless community than someone outside the homeless community is to become a victim of violent crime from someone experiencing homelessness. That is absolutely the case. It is very much the opposite of that. And along with that, you know, the only thing that I have found to be consistent in the stories of individuals that I've worked with over the years, the only consistent, people say, well, what is it? Is it substance use, right? Is it addiction? I don't even like to use the word addiction. Is it substance use? Is it this? Is it that? Is it pure socioeconomic, right? Somebody just like lose their job and so they couldn't pay their rent. No to all of that. The only consistent thread that exists is an experience of trauma. And in most cases, it's an experience of trauma that began in youth and continued and compounded. Every single individual that I have encountered in the street, when you really sit down and you really talk through what the challenges that led here, it all begins with trauma. And as Bob was saying in reference to, you know, the mental health thing, there's a big push. What we need is, it's people who are mentally ill, so they end up in the street. No, I don't believe that's the case either. You know, our brains respond to our environment, and our brains, both chemically and responsively, adjust. And, you know, from a traumatic environment causes our brains to react in ways that has some people manifest what others would try to label schizophrenia, right? Or bipolar, or these terms that are designed to label somebody's symptoms into a category to make them fit into. And it doesn't matter whether it's substance, it doesn't matter whether it's psychological and emotional health. It's all part of the human, the entire human, the physical, the mental, the emotional, that is under immense stress and immense strain. And that is what we genuinely need to respond to. The greatest misconception that there exists out there today in resolving homelessness is that the homelessness is a housing problem. It is not the case. If we focus only on that, we are never going to get it right. There's a lot of examples of how that fails, where the housing is provided in individuals die, because it is not the housing. Housing is a symptom of the manifestation of a history of trauma that compounds to the point where an individual finds themselves lost, alone, and hopeless, and then experiencing the trauma of the street. That is a consistent story across the board. We don't start with the trauma. The housing, the substance, the everything. It's never gonna go anywhere.
I think that's really helpful context. And in particular, I love this kind of holistic reframing of a more solutions-oriented approach to people experiencing these issues. Let's talk solutions a little bit more then. So maybe each of you can kind of go in succession, because I know you're working on this kind of from slightly different angles. How are your specific programs working to address these problems holistically as you've recognized these holistic issues?
I can go ahead and start. So my department at the university, we focus on community engagement. So ways that we can help partner and leverage the resources at the university to help various community issues, whether they're downtown or more broadly speaking. So about 2 years ago, we were asked by some organizations in the city, the Building Owners Association, the Mayor's Office, and the PDP, to engage in a study about public restrooms in Pittsburgh. Homelessness is what we would call a wicked problem, which means that it is really multifaceted, much like many other big problems in the world. And so, to Dave's point, it's not just a housing issue, it's not just a mental health issue, it's a physical health issue. It's all of these things wrapped up into one, and a lot of times one thing impacts another, and sometimes we fix one part of it and it makes a different part of it worse, which is why we call them wicked problems. And they're very difficult to solve, nearly impossible, which is why everybody in the world is trying to focus on solving wicked problems through the UN Sustainable Development Goals and other areas. But one of the things that we know to be true that is a problem for anyone experiencing homelessness is access to clean and safe public restrooms. And we did some research a couple of years ago in Pittsburgh to look at what our city looks like when it comes to public restroom availability. And the answer is that it looks pretty bad. We don't really have any 24/7 clean, safe, accessible public restrooms for people to use. And that includes people like you, like tourists, anybody who lives and works downtown or visits downtown, but also to people experiencing homelessness. And so that obviously can become part of a public health crisis as well if we don't have clean and safe access to toilet facilities. So we engaged in a study with those partners to really look at what was the current situation, what we might recommend Pittsburgh could do based on some research and some benchmarking from other cities around the country and around the world. And we're really happy to say that that initiative has had some impact. So the PDP and the Mayor's Office did end up installing 2 public restrooms. One of them I think we can see from here over in the Gateway Center area, and a second one that was over on Smithfield Street. And we also encouraged the Mayor's Office and the PDP to activate public restrooms that already exist in the city. Many of them are in public parking garages. So most of our parking garages that are owned by the Parking Authority, which is a public entity, do have restroom facilities, but they were often closed or unavailable to people unless you were parking, which really isn't how it should or could be. And so we encourage the city and the PDP to really get engaged in opening those restrooms up really truly for the public, which includes people experiencing homelessness, just like all of the rest of us sitting up here. And that's happening, which is really wonderful to hear. So now we have a couple of accessible public restrooms for people to use. They're still not 24/7. They're open about 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. But we're hoping that that conversation continues with the leaders in our community and the people who have the power to make these changes happen and make policy changes happen, and that we'll continue to see more readily available public restrooms here in Pittsburgh. We know if any of you have visited Europe, it's something that's really common there, and it's easy to find a public restroom. It's not so easy to find a public restroom in the United States. It's much easier to find a note on a door that says no public restrooms available unless you're a paying customer. And so that's something that we believe we need to try and change the narrative and change the language and then change the actual infrastructure to be able to have clean, safe public restroom access for everyone. Going to the restroom should not be a privilege. It should be a right that we all have, and that's something that we're working to help make happen through research that we can do as faculty and students at the university. And our university is right here in the city. These are our neighbors, and we are neighbors in the city. So we want to make sure that this city is livable for everyone.
Thank you. I think it's really important to sort of take an overall snapshot of what services are aside from what we're doing here in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, and to note a lot of people from Pittsburgh and Allegheny County have absolutely no idea that we are probably one of the most efficient cities, major metropolitan cities in the country, in approaching the challenges associated with homelessness, and that's occurred for a long period of time. When I visit other cities, and I have peers from other cities, either in street medicine or in outreach, that are visiting with me and spending time on the streets, people here are absolutely blown away by the extensive nature of the services that we have available and the collaboration that exists. And when I go to other places outside of here, and I see the challenges that occur in other major cities, I gain a new appreciation for the environment that I live in. We have a tremendous coordinated entry system that begins, with Allegheny Link and the Allegheny Link Field Unit that is out in the streets every day. And we have our own housing assessment tool. The Allegheny Housing Assessment Tool is a risk assessment that anybody experiencing homelessness can be assessed, and based on that risk score, they can then become prioritized for supportive housing programs. And we have a pretty extensive list of types and programs and providers, everything from a simple rapid housing program or a bridge housing program up to a permanent supportive housing program, and a system that can be very, very efficient at getting people into those. That's why prior to COVID, I had found the individuals I was working with, we were turning our population over more than one time a year. It was somewhere 1.15, 1.25 times a year. So the same person I'm working with today, a year from now, would be housed, right? And that was consistent for year after year after year until COVID, because of this system. Our current state, right, is looking for ways to take those efficiencies and become more effective. That's where we fall short, is on the effective. And when I turn the mic over to Bob, and he talks more about thriving resident, these are the ideas and these are the things that can make us more effective, right? When we start to understand the need for community, we understand not only the need for community, but how to foster community and how to bring life back to a place where it's no longer a matter of surviving. It can become part of thriving, right? But the street medicine started here in Pittsburgh 32 years ago. 25 years ago, the term street medicine was coined and copyrighted at the Sheraton Station Square at the very first ever International Street Medicine Symposium. And it is now a global movement that the federal government now recognizes as a practice of medicine. There are a lot of things that we do well here. We've been on the forefront in harm reduction. We were the first ones to start bringing harm reduction to the street back in 2016. Narcan naloxone distribution in the street. Knocking down barriers in street level medically assisted treatment through Suboxone, and any medical needs associated with IV drug use. And we now have an extensive network of more than just Dr. Withers and Operation Safety Net, but 4 fully formed functional street medicine programs here in the city. And so we're doing a lot. We're doing an awful lot. And we're doing a lot well. There are a few areas that we need to get a lot better because it's not having the effect that it needs to have. And as a result, people are being hurt, people are dying, and people are undergoing repeated traumas. And so there's a lot good happening, just not quite enough.
Yeah, so everybody, I see community a little bit differently than our traditional notion of community. And the way in which I see community and the way in which I talk about community to my students is a supplement to the way in which we generally see community. So most of us we see community as maybe borders, over there in that area, or sometimes we see community in terms of shared values or demographics or shared experiences. So we have a tendency to use expressions like, well, those folks or those people. And as you all know, those sort of boundaries of a community don't really hold, right? People fluidly move in and out of them. Sometimes people are sort of labeled as not fully something in order to be in that community. Sometimes this has to do with race and gender and sexuality as well. But I see community a little differently. I see community as a phenomenon, as something that happens every day in your lives, as something that is fleeting and unstructured, unplanned moments of kindness. So think about times where, without knowing the person's political background, without knowing necessarily their sexuality or gender, without knowing their ideologies or religious or non-religious, you've been helpful, you've been kind. And it's fleeting. It's only this little moment where we might do it. You might hold the door open for someone, or let somebody in during traffic, or things like that. Or if somebody drops something, you go ahead and grab them and help them. So I became fascinated with this notion of community that just sort of happens in our everyday lives. And I wondered if we could ritualize that and foster and nurture that. And that idea, along with the other supplement, which is thriving along with surviving. Surviving is important, it's crucial, it's the foundation. But to thrive is all the things that we sort of take for granted, right? In other words, to watch a movie and to fall asleep during the movie. So the first time we did the Mobile Thriving Respite wasn't really the Mobile Thriving Respite. We went to the Smithfield Street Shelter. This was pre-COVID. And we played Coco, the film Coco, at the women's shelter. And I'm sitting back there and watching staff and what they call consumers watching Coco together. And I'm thinking, this is a good thing. Done. This is a good thing. And then we came back and we played the first Coming to America, the men's shelter at the Smith down the street. Same thing. People fell asleep during it. People called out jokes. They knew the lines from the movie and things like that. And I thought, this is a good thing. Let's make it mobile. Can we make it mobile? And so basically the idea there is, can we cultivate this notion of community as is happening? The word is called communitas. And so what happens is, with the Mobile Thriving Respite, we show up at different places in the community. It used to be First Presbyterian Church, the First Lutheran Church. We're out in parks, Hot Metal Bridge Faith Community, and the Second Avenue Commons Shelter. So we pop up at different places, and what do? We play cards with folks. We play Jenga with folks. We do karaoke with folks. We sit around and people cut hair, and we just sit around and talk. Or people go around and do folks' nails. You see how getting your nails done is thriving beyond surviving, right? So we try to think of even thriving food. We bring fresh fruit that we just cut, just bought, or fresh pasta dishes that we just made, and bring them, but then encourage folks to sit down and just hang with us. And to do that, I think, has a very small but lovely impact on people's lives. In other words, I'll tell you a quick story where a fellow just sort of put his cards down and looked at us all and said, we're all just playing cards together. We all laughed. We said, yeah, that's all we're doing. We're playing cards together. One fellow was with us one day and told us that he invented homogenized milk. So my student said, oh, tell us about that, right? So we all talked about how he invented homogenized milk. We're not at the respite trying to push an ideology or any other kind of you ought to do this kind of thing. What we're really about at the Mobile Thriving Respite is just to hang and be with people and to offer an opportunity of thriving in those fleeting moments over and above surviving. To what degree it's helpful in this wicked, huge problem, I don't know. I can't tell. I only just generally feel like it's a good thing. Yeah.
I think it's more helpful than you know.
I hope so.
Love that. It's a nice positive spin on things too, to know that you're providing this sort of without an ask. I'm curious. I guess this question I can kind of start with you, Dr. Fiedler, but what role do larger institutions have to play in supporting this thriving? Is this as simple as just throwing a bunch of money at the problem, or is there a more complex role that larger institutions, including Point Park, can play in finding solutions?
Nothing is ever as simple as throwing a bunch of money at a problem. You can't buy your way out of homelessness. We need to really approach it from a lot of different angles, and I believe that universities have a responsibility to help the communities around them. And so I do think that there are things that we can and are and should be doing and doing even more of, all of us as university partners here in Pittsburgh. So the University of Pittsburgh, for example, has several community engagement centers that do really wonderful work in their communities. And we really hope that as a downtown university, really the only university downtown in the Golden Triangle, that we can do our part to help make our community better in some small or big way. And that might look a lot of different ways. So just simply getting our students connected to the community, whether that be with direct service volunteering or with more kind of higher level research that they might do to help further a cause or mission. I think there are lots and lots of different ways that we can engage with our community to move the needle even just a little bit. And it's really our responsibility to do that. We have a lot of really incredible young people who want to leave the world better than they found it. And it's our job, I think, as faculty members to help them and encourage them and empower them to do just that. So in the Department of Community Engagement, we are working to do small things like getting students out to volunteer. We regularly have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich making day that we then partner with Second Avenue Commons and the Red Door to help distribute those. So it's something small, but it's something that's meaningful to people who might not have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that day. So we know that we can teach students that sometimes a small impact can be a big impact in people's lives. But we can also do more thoughtful, longer-term partnerships like what Bob is doing. And I think our department was one of the first ones to give Bob a little bit of money to help that Mobile Thriving Respite and get it started as a proof of concept so we could get much bigger money than what we could necessarily give them at the university. But whether we're working on things like students in courses going out and doing the work that Bob is doing, or students in courses in our PhD program doing research on public restrooms, to students who are just setting foot for the first time in downtown Pittsburgh who might go out and volunteer or make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I think all of these ways that we can partner with community organizations and empower our students and our faculty and staff to really be better neighbors to building community and to helping solve or at least move the needle on some of these problems is not only important and impactful, but in my mind, required for us.
Yeah, you know, Heather, I was thinking about our students. So if you don't know, the students at Point Park that we work with, both undergraduate and graduate, are some funky, activist-oriented, amazingly cool people, and they're often brilliant too. And it's a real pleasure to be around them, right? Now, some of my students have been interning at Bridge Outreach with Dave. And the thing about that just warms my heart is, along with Dave, they have hands-on experience going out there and working with people, right? I'm just a professor. I live a professor-like life, very sort of silly and simple life. But my students, which brings me so much joy, they're the ones who go out and do this kind of work. And the great thing that Point Park University does is sort of cultivates that culture in a way that students feel, and Heather's been huge in this, in that students feel that being part of the community and being engaged in the community is as important, if maybe not more important, than the intellectual pursuit. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, that
And
shade.
here's a really brutally honest answer to the question. Honestly, institutions like Point Park, keep doing what you're doing relative to the education. Don't feel that you need to do more beyond that, because that's the most important part to us, to me, as the individual that's seeking somebody that I can trust and have faith knows how to relate and respond to human beings at a human level, and also have the knowledge and expertise of how best to respond. As I look at the massive number of programs and systems and processes across the country that exist as it relates to services for someone experiencing homelessness, there's a consistent thread. Overwhelmingly, they suck. But then there are these gems, and I love encountering them, finding them, and meeting the people, and going to the cities and seeing firsthand what they're doing and how they're doing it. And this is the reality. When I really look at it, the gems don't come from any institution. The systems and the processes that we have out there generally come from institutions, institutional thought processes, institutional thinking, in ways to serve individuals with institutional trauma. It's counterintuitive. It really is. And it's so much easier than it's made out to be. It's like, be a human, almost. Be a human, and coexist and be human with somebody else and want to be there and be present and be in somebody's life. And then, we have this massive push everywhere from the federal level all the way through when it comes to funding and everything else for what they call trauma-informed care. Their idea of trauma-informed care has nothing to do with allowing the trauma as an individual to inform the care that you provide. Their idea of trauma-informed care is having a staff of 35 people and hiring one person as a peer support specialist who has some lived experience, and calling them a peer support specialist and paying them half what you are everybody else to do the same job, and saying our organization is trauma informed because we have people with lived experience. That's crap. If you do it right, if you really want to be out there, every single person in the street is going to inform what your organization does and how it does. You don't need one person on your payroll to have lived experience. You need to be someone that is part of an organization that is genuinely moving to respond to the human condition that is around them in a way that, if nothing else, can ease suffering. It doesn't have to have a solution. Institutional trauma is the single greatest manifestation of trauma that I see, whether it's trauma within our healthcare systems, for people that use substances, or just somebody that the healthcare system even thinks is homeless, and the way someone is treated. Our judicial system, our law enforcement, our prison system, there is more than enough institution in somebody's life by the time they make it to the street. So the question, what should our institutions do? Focus on what they do really well. What Point Park does really well is educate. And it is a phenomenological approach to people that we need.
Just real quick. So there's an excellent book called Citizens Without Shelters by a guy named Feldman. And he makes an interesting sweeping point about what's happened in the United States especially. And he uses these expressions which I find really compelling. And the first expression is a politics of compassion. So in this country, we have had a politics of compassion where our institutions may have been more compassionate, where ourselves, as we are in our communities, more compassionate. Then he makes a point that really kind of hurts, which is we also sometimes suffer from fatigue, right? Compassion fatigue, a politics of compassion fatigue. And we get tired, especially individually, when our institutions aren't doing what we want them to do. And individually, we get tired of the problem of homelessness, right? Especially if you live in the city, right? And I thought that was fascinating about this idea. We just get tired of it, and then we start to have apathy. And I often say that apathy is like community depression, right? Apathy to be deadened to the suffering of others around and about you. And then finally, the worst case for us would be a punitive politics, right? And that's the kind of politics we see where people are arrested for trying to help folks, right? Where we make it illegal to be able to serve food to somebody, right? And where we become more punishing. And I worry that this has happened and might continue to happen in this city. It's certainly a good example of punitive politics would be spikes in doorways, unable to sit on a bench, or in other words, to be able to lie down on the bench. And so I think that's kind of fascinating, where we once had maybe a little bit more of that politics of compassion. We get fatigued, and then we get punitive. And so I think to look at the institutions in that way too would be helpful. How do we need to rethink this particular problem and how our institutions need to change?
All right. We have just about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to open up to some questions from the audience. I see we have one already. If you could just speak your question aloud so I can hear it, and then I'll read it aloud through the mic.
Yeah, I guess my question is that relates to causes of homelessness.
The question was about the about the connections between European human trafficking and the way that relates to homelessness. I don't know if any of you guys want to.
Let me start by saying thank you so much for sharing your story, and I'm sorry that you had to experience that and the results of that. You are not unique. This is something that occurs regularly. Trafficking is a challenge that exists here, but a perfect example of trauma and then repeated trauma, right? Forced displacement from your home, brought to somewhere other than your home, the trauma of that, and then the trauma of not having your parents, the trauma of medical procedures that you don't have records of, that you don't know about, the way too often, society just allow these things to go on, allow these things to occur, and because it's not a large enough percentage of our total population, it's like, oh, that's just part of it, whatever. Like, that's just, yeah, but for most everybody else, it's okay, yeah, but it's not. So I'm really sorry that you had to experience that, and you're absolutely right. You're a big part of this story that leads into challenges that we see manifesting themselves out here in the streets.
Any other questions from members of the audience? Any other questions? Yeah, Nick. Yes, please.
Hello, Newsy Nick here. So Dr. Bob, this question is for you and all three of you. Whenever we talked previously about interacting with our community, there are a lot of little things that we can do to acknowledge the humanity in another person. What are some things that the audience here and people that are passing by can take away in their day-to-day as they move throughout their lives to acknowledge that humanity in someone else?
Well, first of all, how about making some eye contact? You know, how about some eye contact and a smile? Hello to somebody is lovely for all of us. I think it's a good idea. I happen to like Fig Newtons. Anybody into Fig Newtons? I like Fig Newtons. I carry Fig Newtons around. When somebody asks me for something, sometimes I have cash and I have some wants, and I'm happy to do that. But a lot of times I've got Fig Newtons. I carry around Fig Newtons. I carry around other sort of power bars and things like that. And I also have Narcan in my bag. And finally, I even have some hygiene products. And these are all some of the stuff that we have with the Mobile Thriving Respite. But to be honest, think about the word address. But the word to have an address, right? You think, I have a home and I have an address. But what the word address means is to be addressed, right? To be not invisible, but to be welcome. And again, it's a little thing. I don't know how much of an impact it has, but I work very hard myself as to be able to make eye contact with folks, to say hi to somebody, and even spend a minute or two talking to somebody just because they're part of the community that I'm part of. And so I think that's a good idea.
I agree with Bob. I think for me, I don't have Fig Newtons, I have Camel Blues. Instead of looking maybe at what can we do to directly get involved or in some way have some positive effect in some way, engaged with someone that we see in the street. I can tell you this in all honesty, the most amazing, most fascinating people that I've met throughout the course of my life have been in the street. And so for me, it's genuine love and curiosity of the human experience and looking for opportunities that more than just have a quick pass by, hello, hey, you need a cigarette here. It's like genuinely like, man, like I really like to know your story. Like I'll tell you mine. Like I'll sit here next to you, smoke a cigarette with you, have a cup of coffee. One of my favorite things to do is I love it when you meet somebody new and it's just like this amazing, like, crazy life story, and just sit down there for hours and just being and sharing.
I think it's important for us to think about not just the other person, but ourselves. In order to build that compassion and really grow community, we need to really realize that everyone has a story. And we started out talking about perceptions, and I think it's important for us to stop and really ask ourselves, are we experiencing some implicit bias when I look at somebody who is experiencing homelessness, when I divert my eyes or don't say hello? And if we instead stop and think not about them, but about us, about what is it within us that we can maybe change and we can grow and be better at. It'll help us, I think, be better humans to those around us and really realize that everyone has a story. And thank you again for sharing your story. It's important for us to hear other people's stories. And that is something that I think we all need to stop and work on ourselves in order to become better humans, which is what this is really all about.
I have a quick question right now.
I mean, I would say from a journalistic perspective, one thing that you should definitely consider is submitting right-to-know requests and Freedom of Information Act requests. You can do that fairly easily through the state of Pennsylvania. It's a little bit trickier at a federal level, and sometimes people can ignore your responses for that. But there is a legal obligation in all jurisdictions in the United States to provide a degree of transparency about documents around that stuff. What the individual process is varies from that jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So if it's a city, a state, a county, a nation, it's a different process of submitting and requesting that information. But just as a journalist, that would be one first step you might take. All right. Folks, we are about out of time. Oh, we have one more question up front here. Yes. Yeah, for if anyone didn't hear, the audience member
Thank you.
suggested, thank you for that. The audience member suggested not only seeking ways to use people experiencing homelessness, potentially to staff additional toilet facilities, but also the addition of a shower facility, which definitely would make a big difference downtown. Thank you for suggesting that, sir.
Remember Run DMC. P is never dirty. MC is must be clean.
Run DMC, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, well, we are at our time, but I did want to just leave one last opportunity for you all to say how folks can engage with or otherwise support the work that you're doing here in Pittsburgh.
Go to bridgepgh.org and click on donate.
Yeah. The misconception about the whole mobile thriving respite is yes, it's for quote unquote the street community. We didn't really talk about language so much about that, but it's to blur the boundary between what might be called the street community and the rest of housed folks and whatever language you want to use. So if you see the mobile thriving respite around, you come and play cards with us. That'll change, right? Play Jenga with us, right? And everybody that shows up. So we have kids showing up when we're in the park and things like that. And we have folks just hanging around meeting each other for the first time. So don't be shy. Come by and hang with us too.
Everything you said, our job, I think, in my department is to reach out and help. So if you're interested in coordinating or partnering with Point Park in any way, we would love to talk to you in the Department of Community Engagement.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you all for coming out to our very first Market Square News Breaks. Our next one is happening next month, so be sure to follow us on all social media platforms at Point Park CMI to learn more about that. Also, I have some handouts. If you didn't get one, you can come talk to me afterward. Appreciate Colin for moderating this discussion, and thank you to all of our guests that have joined us here on stage today. And most importantly, thank you to you for joining in the conversation, for being here. I've been out the past few weeks talking to people every Thursday here in Market Square, and one of the things whenever I ask, what could local news, what could local media be doing more regularly, and most of them said this right now, having these discussions, talking to each other, especially in this public area, right? Market Square is our public square. Again, thanks to Point Park University, thanks to the Pittsburgh Downtown Partnership for sponsoring us today. And make sure you come out next month for our next Market Square News Breaks. And you can catch me, Newsy Nick, again here tomorrow around lunchtime. Feel free to talk to me about local news and the local media. Thanks for joining. Bye, everyone.